Good evening, everyone. My name is Craig Amason, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for the Meyer Library here at Missouri State University in Springfield. On behalf of the library's Ozarks Studies Institute, I would like to welcome you to our very first virtual author visit to campus, featuring the novelist Allen Eskens. And on behalf of Tom Peters, our Dean of Libraries, and Melissa, our fearless executive assistant, who helped us set up this Zoom event, we thank you for joining us. And I can assure you that I have every finger and toe crossed in hopes that we will avoid any technical difficulties over the next hour. In the spirit of full disclosure, please be aware that tonight's program is being recorded and will be posted on the library's YouTube channel at some point and promoted through its presence on the web. So let's begin. Allen Eskens is the best-selling author of 6 novels, starting with the highly acclaimed title, The Life We Bury, which won a barrel full of awards and was a finalist for the prestigious Edgar Award, presented annually by the Mystery Writers of America. His books have been reviewed in major publications, including the New York Times, but also in the more selective markets, such as the Southern Literary Review, whose editors are probably always shocked to learn that there are indeed fine writers outside the Deep South. Mr. Eskens' books are set primarily in Minnesota, the state where he lives. However, his most recent novel, Nothing More Dangerous, takes place where the author grew up, in the upper regions of the Ozarks, which of course caught our attention. The starred review of the book in Library Journal praised it as, quote, a must-read for followers of the best in crime fiction. In reviewing the novel for the New York Journal of Books, author and critic D.R. Meredith wrote, quote, on a scale of 1 to 10, Nothing More Dangerous is at least an 11. Mr. Eskens has a journalism degree from the University of Minnesota and a law degree from Hamline University. He has also studied creative writing. He practiced criminal law for 25 years, giving him an insider's perspective on writing crime fiction, which he is now doing full time. His books have been translated, I think, into 26 different languages, and he's just getting started. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Allen Eskens.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you tonight. I am a northern writer, I guess, outside the southern realm, but I grew up in Missouri. And like Craig said, it heavily influenced my desire to become a writer, and my 6th novel, which I'll get into in much more detail in a little bit. But I want to begin by talking about my journey to become a writer, because my journey is not your normal journey that writers often talk about in these kind of events. When I first became a writer, I had never been to an author event before. So I started going to author events to see what it was they would talk about. And they usually talked about what was it that led them to want to become a writer. And they would talk about things like how they loved reading books when they were younger, how they spent their time in libraries, how they wrote their first short story in 3rd grade. And the more I listened to these authors, the more I realized that my path was different. So I went in search of what was it that made me want to become a writer. And my search took me back to Jefferson City, Missouri, where I grew up, to a bin in my mother's closet where she kept my school memorabilia. And in that bin, I found what I believe is the reason I'm a writer today. And I found it on my 1st grade report card. On my 1st grade report card, on the back where my parents have to sign, my teacher wrote, Allen dreams too much when work is to be done in school. And that is, I think, why I'm a writer today. I have always been a prolific daydreamer. Daydreaming was my favorite part of school. You set me anywhere near a window, I would look out and I was gone. And because of my excessive daydreaming, I was never a good student. I barely got passing grades. But I was okay with that because I never thought that education was going to be important for me. I grew up in a construction family. My dad owned a drywall company. And from my earliest recollections, I worked for his drywall company. And so I always kind of figured that when I got out of school, I would do construction, probably drywall. So I never really cared about getting good grades. And I was well on my path to being a mediocre student my entire life. But when I got into fifth grade, something happened to change the trajectory of my life. And what happened was because of a teacher. My fifth grade teacher got me into the school play. And when I say she got me into the school play, I didn't even know the school was having a play. And to be in the play, you had to be a sixth, seventh, or eighth grader. But this teacher saw something in me. Later I asked her, she said she saw this creative side to me and she wanted to help, nurture it. So she got me into the school play and I got a part. And not only did I get a part in the play, I got the best part in the whole play, which wasn't the lead. The best part in the whole play was the only character who got to say a cuss word. You see, I went to a Catholic school, and this was, the early 70s, I guess, back then. And my first performance was grades 1 through 4 of my school. And my line, I said, I was this prisoner who they were going to hang. And there was this priest trying to get me to confess my sins. And he said, "Are you sure you won't confess your sins?" I said, "Yes, I'm sure. Damn it, go away." And when I said, "Damn it," those little kids, their eyes lit up and I became a celebrity. Everybody knew me. And I thought, I like this acting thing. Well, my school didn't put on any more plays. And so I went back to my old ways of being not just a mediocre student, but a really terrible student. I hated school. By the time I graduated, by the time I got out of 8th grade, going to high school, I wanted nothing to do with school. And I actually vowed when I got into high school, I wasn't going to do anything extracurricular. I wasn't going to give to my school anything more than I absolutely had to. And I get into high school, and in first semester, I am fulfilling that vow. I am, again, a terrible student. I flunked Spanish and algebra that first semester. I'm getting D's and C's in my other classes. I was the kid you didn't want your kid hanging around with. But then the spring semester rolled around and I heard that the school was going to put on a play. And me and my buddy were talking about the play, and I told him about this play I did in 5th grade and how much fun it was. And somehow by the end of that conversation, we had dared each other to try out for this play, which was Oklahoma. I had never even seen a musical in my life, much less be in one. But we auditioned, we got into it, and it was fun. It was such a blast. And the really cool thing about high school plays versus grade school plays is at the end of the high school play, when that final curtain comes down, everybody's going around hugging everybody else. And they're really emotional. And here I am, this geeky freshman getting hugged by these beautiful junior and senior women. And I'm thinking, why would you play football when you can do this? So I found something that I was passionate about. I loved theater. I really did. And for the first time in my entire life, I had a reason to go to school. I had some purpose behind it. And I threw myself into theater. Anything that was theater related, I did. Any chorus class, all that stuff. And I got straight A's in all the theater related classes, even though I was still getting C's and D's in my other classes. And when my senior year rolled around and I saw my future coming toward me, and there were two paths. One was going into drywall, but the other path was going to college and maybe doing this theater thing for just a little bit longer before I had to put on my tool belt and go hang sheetrock. So my senior year, I buckled down. I worked hard. I got my GPA up to a solid 2.5. But I did well on the ACT and I got into college. And when I got into college, I went there as a theater major thinking I was just going to do a couple years of college and that was it. But I found that I really enjoyed learning. It was it was a metamorphosis for me that I didn't expect. And I started studying all these different things that I never thought that I would be interested in. I was studying memory and cognition. I was studying Hindu. I was studying the astronomy and geology and marketing and economics. And I was just having a ball. And I realized that if I wanted to stay in college, I had to buckle down, become a student, a real student, and pick a major. So I went in search of a major that had very little math in it because I'm really bad at math. And I came up with journalism. So I got my degree in journalism. And the last 2 years of that degree, it took me 7 years to get through my undergrad because I was working my way through and I was taking all these classes that really didn't have, they weren't part of any particular major. It was just me having, a thirst for learning. But it took me 7 years to get through undergrad. And by the end, the last couple of years, I was getting straight A's. And I wondered, what would it have been like if I had tried from the very beginning to be a good student? And really, for no better reason than to test that, I went to law school because I never really had a desire or a dream to be a lawyer, but I just wanted to see if I could do it. And so I went to law school and I really tried hard. And for the first time in my life, I was a student. That was my purpose in life, was to be a student. And I excelled in law school and I loved law school. And I graduated law school with a terrific resume. And I get a job as a judicial law clerk. And that first summer, 1992, I'm in my office as a judicial law clerk and something's not right. Something's missing. And what's missing was that creative side that I had honed and loved and developed a passion for in theater. And so I went in search of something that I could do to exercise that creative side. I thought, well, I'm pretty good with words. Let's try writing. So in the summer of 1992, I sat down and wrote a short story about a 15-year-old boy who is growing up in Missouri and loves to daydream. Well, I finished that short story, and having never taken a class in creative writing, I had no idea if it was good or not. So I bought a book on stories, Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I read that book and learned the importance of the hero's journey, which, and for those of you who don't know, the hero's journey is your protagonist starts the story at a certain place in their lives, the status quo. This is who they are. This is what their world is like. And they see themselves and they see the world a certain way. They then go on this journey, a crucible that changes them. And over the course of that story, they learn something. And at the end of the story, they see themselves or they see the world differently. So there's this change. And I looked at my short story that I'd written and I realized that I didn't have a journey in it. It was just, a story about a kid who daydreams. And so I asked myself, what would be the journey that I would want to tell if I were going to make this into a novel? And what came to me was from my own experience. I wanted to tell the story of a young man who grows up in a community where he believes he is not prejudiced. He's a good-hearted kid. He believes he's not prejudiced, but he later comes to understand that he does hold prejudices, but they're latent, they're subconscious, they're so deeply ingrained in him, he doesn't realize that that's what they are. And then by the end of the story, he comes to see those things about himself. So that's the story that I wanted to tell. So I started writing this short story into a novel. And I started taking classes in novel writing. I started reading more books in novel writing. I read a ton of books. I took a ton of classes. I entered the MFA program here in Mankato, where I live, and I have 3/4 of an MFA degree. I studied for 20 years while I was building my law practice and practicing law and raising a family. And so for 20 years, I studied writing, and I realized that I had a passion for writing. I I uncovered something that I didn't know about myself. I love telling stories. So I what one of the things that I came across during that 20-year of education was a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke in Letters to a Young Poet. The young poet asks Rilke, "How do I know if I'm a writer?" And Rilke's response was, "Ask yourself in your most solemn moments, must I write?" And if the answer to that is yes, then you are a writer and you should conform your life accordingly. When I found that quote, I pondered it and realized that I had a good law practice. I enjoyed practicing law, but it wasn't a passion. It wasn't something that made me want to wake up in the morning and get out of bed. It was a job. I was a writer. And so I started taking it more seriously. So after 20 years of working on this short story, which was now a manuscript, and I'd written it and rewritten it and rewritten it, after 20 years, it wasn't ready, and I didn't know why. So I put it aside, and I sat down and outlined my second manuscript, and I wrote my second novel, which became my first published novel, The Life We Bury. It's a story of a young college-age kid named Joe Talbert, who gets an assignment in college to write somebody's life story. So he goes to a nursing home to find a subject. There he meets this man named Carl Iverson, who is dying of cancer, who's a Vietnam vet, but who spent 30 years in prison for murder. And Joe decides to interview Carl. And it's through this interview that Joe gets pulled into this 30-year-old mystery. But it's also the story of Joe wanting to run away from home and leave behind his responsibility for his autistic younger brother. And so the interview that he has with Carl, which starts out as a homework assignment, turns into, he becomes Carl's confessor, and Carl confides in him this secret that Carl's been carrying his entire life, or not his entire adult life. But so that was the basic premise for The Life We Bury. I finished the manuscript. I sent it out to get an agent, and I was rejected by 150 agents. And while I was getting rejected, I wrote another manuscript because I understood at this point I was a writer. Whether I got published or not, I was going to write stories because that is what brought me joy. And so I started my third manuscript, which became my second published novel. So shortly after I finished my first draft of that third manuscript, I got an agent for The Life We Bury. Within a few weeks of sending it out to publishers, we had 2 offers for publication, accepted one. Now I am up and running. I'm going to be a published author. And because I had this third manuscript that I'd written, I went to my agent and I said, I want to do a 3-book deal based on this next manuscript. And I wanted a 3-book deal simply because I'd been reading about people getting 3-book deals, and I thought it sounded cool. I really didn't have, I'm stumbling through this at this point. I didn't have an idea of what that meant to have a 3-book deal. And my agent said, well, give me a synopsis for the stories. And so what I did when I wrote this third manuscript was I took a secondary character from The Life We Bury, and I wrote a story about him. His name is Max Rupert. He's a homicide detective, and he's a co-protagonist actually in that next story. And so what I did was I decided to do a 3-book arc for Max, where over the course of these 3 books, his character goes through that hero's journey that I talked about. He begins the 3 books by the first of the 3 books as a Boy Scout. He's the good brother in a good brother, bad brother story. In the second of the books, he is contemplating that aspect of himself, and he decides to start breaking some rules. And in doing so, that leads to the 3rd book, where he is faced with his darkest nature. Well, before The Life We Bury even hit the store shelves, I had a contract for those 3 books. Now I'm an author. And by the time I'd written the second of those 3 Max Rupert books, I'd retired from my practice of law, and I was a full-time author. But I still had this story about this 15-year-old boy in my drawer, and I wanted desperately to write that story, because that's the one that I became a writer to write. It lived with me, for 20 years. But my publisher wanted me to do a sequel to The Life of Barry, which I had an idea for a sequel that I thought would be good. And I made a deal with my publisher, I'll do the sequel, but then I'm going to do this Nothing More Dangerous. So I signed up for 2 more books, wrote the sequel, and then I went back to this story that I had started in 1992. And rather than get it out of the closet or get it out of the drawer and look at it and try and fix it, I didn't even look at it. I sat down and outlined it from beginning to end as if I'd never written it before. When I had the outline done, I knew I'd fixed the problems with it, because the problems that existed were because I had created this story bit by bit by bit. When I would learn a new technique, new dialogue technique or new, profluence technique, I would add it to the story. But I never had an overarching concept of what this story was about, because I'd never outlined it. And I discovered on The Life of Barry that I was an outliner. So I went back and I outlined it, and I sat down and started writing it. Every now and again, I would remember, I wrote a particularly good passage to describe this particular scene. So I'd go back to the old manuscript and pull that, 1, 2, 3 paragraphs out and put it in the new manuscript. But overall, it's the same story, but I only used about 15% of that original manuscript in the final novel, just because I had grown as a writer from writing those other 5 novels. So in 2019, Nothing More Dangerous finally got published. I was incredibly happy to get to the end of that road. I was concerned that I might die before I finished that novel, again, because it was a novel that I became a writer to write, and it is my only Missouri novel. It is the story of Bodie Sandin, who, in The Life of Barry, Bodie Sandin is an adult. He is an attorney, actually, a law professor, and he's a secondary character in The Life of Barry. And I did that because when I was writing The Life of Barry, I was creating this character who was very much modeled after who I became after going through college and law school. I was an attorney and, constitutional scholar of sorts. So I decided that this 15-year-old kid that I'd been writing about for 20 years and this adult in the present are the same person. So Nothing More Dangerous is Bodie Sandin when he is 15 years old in 1976. He's growing up in a town called Jessup, Missouri, a fictional town. And he is lonely. He is unhappy. He does not like where he's at. He lives with his widowed mother on this dead-end gravel road, and he wants nothing more than to leave and run away. Also on that gravel road, living next door to him, is an older gentleman named Hoke Gardner. Down at the end of the road, there is, of all things, a drywall company. And the owner of the drywall company is an important character in the story. And really, the people on this gravel road are Bodie, his mother, Hoke Gardner, and the drywall company owner. And they all have their own journeys in the course of this novel, especially Hoke. But Bodie, his life changes in the late spring of 1976, because across the road from Bodie is this beautiful old Victorian house that's been sitting empty for 5 years, ever since the previous owner died. And the story begins, the house has sold. And so Bodie's excited, he's going to get new neighbors. And then he finds out that the new neighbors are bringing along with them their son, who is Bodie's age. And when they move in, Bodie discovers that they are Black. And that's the catalyst for the inciting incident for the story. And over the course of that summer, Bodhi starts to learn about his own prejudices when he befriends Thomas, the son in this family. And it also starts, this family moving into this dead-end gravel road changes how Bodhi sees everybody in that community. So this young man who wants nothing more than to run away discovers by the end of the novel that what he really wanted the entire time was to have a place he didn't want to run away from. So that is the story of Nothing More Dangerous. I'm going to take a few minutes to read an excerpt from Nothing More Dangerous. And when I'm finished with that, what I'm hoping is that we can open this up for questions, for Q&A. And I'll answer anything you ask within reason. So this part of the story, Bodhi has just met his new neighbor, Thomas, and their first interaction did not go well. And it didn't go well because Bodhi said something that he thought was completely innocent, but was in fact quite racist. And he didn't understand why Thomas, this new neighbor, took offense. And in this passage, the Elgins, that's the new neighbors, Thomas Elgin, have moved into this Victorian house that Tilly Dixon used to live in. And Bodhi's just kind of looking at this house and looking at this new family, and it just doesn't feel right for this family to be in that house. So I'm going to read just a little bit from that. The road between Shenniker's and Hoke's place took me up a stretch covered with thick canopy of oak branches, under which I stepped lightly as I listened to the night. When I neared my house, a hint of music floated on the breeze, coming from the Dixon place. Light shining through the uncovered windows opened the old house up like a picture book, and I could see the Elgins moving around inside. Tilly had rarely kept more than one light on at a time, and the upstairs had been all but abandoned. She had outlived her husband by 10 years, and in those years, her world shrank to the point that she never had to leave the main floor of the house, cordoning off a living area made up of a kitchen, dining room, family room, and the cook's bedroom and bath, which she now occupied as her own. The fireplace in the family room remained unlit, its chimney clogged with swallows' nests. The rich maple banister, which curved elegantly in a perfect slide between the first and second floors, collected dust, waiting for the day when a child might once again race down its back. The beds upstairs went untouched, sacred relics stored in a silent tabernacle. The house, built in the hopes that generations of Dixons would warm its floors, had been reduced to a handful of rooms, graced by a single pair of tiny feet in worn gray slippers. One time, just a year or so before she died, I saw Tilly moving through the upstairs, wandering the silent halls, pausing to stare into the vacant spaces, her tiny frame dwarfed by the archways and bold woodwork of the bedrooms. She stared into the rooms, as if images in her mind took form and moved through the house with her, bringing life to the emptiness. I somehow assumed that when she died, the house would die with her, but now the old place sparkled with life and light, and something about that struck me as being all wrong. Across the road, at my house, a pale blue light flickered through the living room window, where I would find my mom sitting on our faded brown couch, the rest of the house cloaked in darkness, her sadness kept at bay by the glow of a television. The sadness, my term for it, had come to our house when my father died. As a child, I had no better way to describe why my mother never smiled, why she sometimes shut herself in her room after supper or stared at the blue hum of a television until she fell asleep on the couch, why she never asked me where I was going when I charged out of the house in the morning, or where I'd been when I come home late at night. For my mother, speaking seemed a thing that took effort, as if a heavy weight pressed her into efficiency, and each word came with a price. The sadness had come suddenly, a misplaced step on a scaffolding plank, and now it clung to her like a cold, wet robe. As a child, I used to say prayers while kneeling next to my bed, my mother at my side. I prayed to God for my father's soul, and I prayed that God would keep us safe and healthy. But then, after Mom left, I would slide out of bed and ask God to make her happy. I watched and I waited some more. Eventually, I quit praying. When I was 10, I found a box of postcards that my mother kept on a shelf in her closet, cards that she had gotten from my father. Mom had been his sweetheart since high school, and he wrote such loving things to her, ending each missive with, "Missing my songbird." I thought that to be a lovely sentiment, although for the life of me, I couldn't figure out where that nickname came from. My mother never sang. Once I thought about asking her, but it would have exposed my crime of snooping through her things. In that same box, I found a bunch of pictures taken of our little family before my father's death. My favorite shots were of the three of us having a picnic. We were happy, my mom and dad smiling like little children. I looked to be about 2 years old in those pictures, sitting on my father's broad shoulders, pulling at his hair. My mother sparkled with a happiness reserved for someone just starting out a marvelous new adventure, her eyes young and alive with laughter as she pushed me on a swing. I made quite a few trips to my mom's closet back then, and I fell in love with those people in those pictures. I wanted so badly to remember that part of my life. I would close my eyes and try to recall a day I might have had with my father. I tried to remember my mother happy like that, but I couldn't. Looking back and forth between my house and the Elgins, I couldn't bring myself to go home, to sit in silence next to my mother and mark the passing of time with a television. I wanted to run into the woods and be someplace where being alone made sense. So that is a passage from Nothing More Dangerous. As I said, it is the story that I became a writer to tell. It took me 28 years to finally get it from first thought to store shelves. And I'm terribly proud of that book and how it's been received. That New York Journal review is one of my favorites. But yeah, I have now gone back and I'm writing 2 more books right now. My 7th book is coming out in September. Going back to the life of Barry, Joe Talbot, in that novel, he meets a young woman named Lila Nash. Over the course of that novel and 2 more, he and Lila become close and they're dating. My next book is actually Lila's story. It's my first female protagonist, and it's coming out September 7th, and the title is The Stolen Hours. And it goes back to things that happened in the life of Barry. In the life of Barry, she tells Joe about this event that happened to her in high school. And in The Stolen Hours, she gets an opportunity to go back and examine that incident that happened to her in high school. And then the book I'm writing right now, which will be my 8th novel, is going to be Max Rupert's 4th. And I'm really enjoying writing it. And the thing is, I love writing. So I get up every day and I look forward to going downstairs and sitting in my comfortable chair and writing. It's what I would do for enjoyment, even if I didn't get paid for it. So to get paid for it is just a blessing. So with that, I'm going to open this up for the Q&A, and I will invite any questions at this time.
This is a representative applause from all our participants. Thank you very much, Alan. That was wonderful. We actually do have some questions coming in, and folks, if you would type your questions, don't be shy. Type your questions into the chat box there, and we'll relay them to Alan. First question, if you're ready, is many Americans like their novels and movies neatly wrapped and resolved by the end. As one wag said, without death and marriage, novels would never end. This novel seems to leave 2 important sources of tension basically unresolved. 1, the homophobia evident in this town, and 2, love interest, which blossoms during that wonderful school dance episode. What's your response to the closure?
Okay. With regard to the homophobic tension, I thought about delving into that more, but I decided not to because that would detract from the main prejudices in the novel, which is what I really wanted to focus on. So it was just my own decision not to add one more layer to this novel. There's already so many things going on in this story. I wanted the homophobic aspect to come into play to point out, number one, it's there. That is not something that was newly created since the 70s, but also that by the time that Bodhi sees it, he's already made enough of a journey that he looks upon that new revelation with a sense of enlightenment. I don't want to give away too much of how it comes about, but it's because of his mother, him seeing his mother in a new light, that he also sees this other person in this new light as well. And the other one is the relationship. My third novel is called The Heavens May Fall. And in The Heavens May Fall, this homicide detective, Max Rupert, that I wrote about, is on a case where he thinks he knows who committed this crime. The person who is being accused of this is being defended by an attorney, Bodhi Sandin. So Bodhi and Max are friends in The Life We Bury. In The Heavens May Fall, they actually go against each other in this case. And if you are reading carefully, you will see that Bodhi is married to a woman named Diana, and that she's Black. And so the relationship actually, for readers of my novels who already have read that novel, The Heavens May Fall, it goes by very quickly, the little Easter egg reference in there, but he actually ends up marrying her, the girl he meets in high school.
Very good. Here's more of a perhaps a business question. How did you find the address to send to, an agent's name and address to submit stories?
To find agents, there were at that time books you could buy that had lists of agents. There were also 2 really good websites, and this was 2011, 2012, somewhere in that neighborhood. So I don't even know if those websites exist anymore or what their names. I don't remember their names, but there were these websites that said, okay, here's a list of all the literary agents in the country. Here's what kind of genres they like to represent. Here's their address. And most agents nowadays do email submissions. So you type up your query letter, and your query letter is basically saying, here, my name is Allen Eskens. I wrote this novel. Here's a paragraph of what this novel's about. Here's my accolades, which I had none. Please represent me. And then you cross your fingers. You hope they ask for a copy of the manuscript, and then you send it in. And again, I was rejected by 150 agents, primarily because I had a prologue in The Life We Bury that the agent who finally took me said, get rid of the prologue. That, it's a different voice. It is not necessary. And she was absolutely right. I think that if I had no prologue, I might have gotten an agent quicker, but I don't know for sure.
Here's a question related to the latest novel. What roles and functions do homes and places play in this novel, in particular the fishing pond?
So, like I alluded to, this novel is drawn from my growing up in Missouri. And quite frankly, there's a ton of stuff in here that is personal references for me. So I grew up on a dead-end gravel road. There were more people living on my road than what Bodhi had in his life, but that gave me the sense of what it's like to live in isolation. We were surrounded by acres and miles of woods. And so I grew up in the woods. I loved climbing trees. I loved swinging on vines. There's a scene in there where Bodhi and Thomas jump out of a cedar tree just to slide down. We used to do that. And so I drew from my memory and my experiences. There was a tree out in the woods that it was a huge oak tree, enormous oak tree, but it leaned at like this 45-degree angle. And you could just take a jog and run right up the tree. And I spent hours and hours and hours in that tree out in the middle of the woods, just hanging out, just thinking. And so when I wrote about Bodhi, I put this tree, this leaning tree, beside this fishing pond. I also had a fishing pond that was in the woods. That actually it was in a hayfield that my neighbor had, and I spent a lot of time at the fishing pond. So I put these things in there because they meant a lot to me. And when I was writing about Bodhi, I wanted to really know this kid inside and out. And so I drew from those experiences of my own. Writing about place is, it's a joy when you do understand and know the place. So when I'm writing novels about Minnesota, because I live here, I know, I know what it's like to stand outside in 20 degree below zero before wind chill. I know what it's like to dig a hole in the ice when you want to go fishing. In Missouri, I know what it's like to sweat. The swelty summers, and as a kid, I loved sweating. I just, I get off the school bus, I'd open my shirt up and just let the breeze take me as I'm walking down the gravel road to go home. So there's those little things that it's hard to encapsulate if you haven't lived it. So if I were to write a story about growing up in Norway, it would be cold. I mean, not cold temperature, but just cold in terms of the atmosphere of the writing, because I wouldn't know, those experiences. I have in the back of my mind a desire to write a historical fiction that takes place during World War II. I am hesitant to do that because I would want to take a lot of time and just delve into what it was like to live in that era. From the buttons you would have on your coat down to the, what the stores would sell, what were the advertisements like in the newspaper, just all these little things that you'd want to know. And so writing about place, it gives you everything when you're doing it well and you're writing about something, and when you read a novel by someone who is writing about a place they didn't personally experience, I applaud those who can create that world in a way that draws people in. I think it's hard to do.
Here's another question about your writing process. What does your typical day look like? How many hours do you generally spend writing? How much time is devoted to research and such?
So when I was practicing law and writing, I was doing nothing but those two things. So I made a vow that when I was at the office, I was going to focus on my clients and do a good job. But as soon as I came home, I was not going to practice law. I was going to write novels. And fortunately, I have a wife who was very understanding and took up the extra, duties at home. So I would come home, I go downstairs and I'd work. Now it's much nicer. I get up in the morning, I have a cup of coffee, I have biscotti. When I am ready, around 8:30, 9 o'clock, I'll go downstairs and I sit in a recliner with my laptop literally on my lap, my feet up, and I just, I write. I daydream. I think, okay, I'm in the scene. I put myself in the shoes of the point of view character in the scene. I imagine what it would be, and I start writing. I usually do at least 1,000 words a day. I could do more. I know a lot of writers who do 2,000 or 3,000 words a day. I find that when I do a lot of words in a single day, they're not my best words. One of the things in theater that I discovered, that I learned, was your best ideas, your most creative ideas, usually aren't the first, second, or third idea that comes to you. I learned this in improv. So you're standing in a line waiting to go on stage, and the director says, okay, there's a chair on stage. Everybody take turns. You go to the chair and act out a scene on that chair. Well, the first 2 or 3 people out there, they're going to do the first thing that comes to your mind. So as you're sitting there, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to be on a bus. And then the person in front of you is on a bus. So you have to come up with something else. And I found that taking the time to go past your first, second, third, fourth idea into your fifth and sixth idea, you actually come up with more original content. And so when I'm writing, the first thing that comes to my head, I usually assume that that's probably not the best idea. It's been used before. It could be cliche. So then I sit back, okay, next. So I don't really push it in terms of how much I write a day, but I'll write for a while. Then I'll go, exercise. Exercise is a wonderful thing for the creative mind. I come up with so many ideas. I actually take my phone with me, which has a recording app on my phone, just so while I'm on the treadmill or the elliptical, I have these ideas. And I just turn the recorder on and talk into my telephone to give myself my ideas. Then when I go back to my comfy chair, I have all these ideas that I can play with. So about 1,000 words a day. So I'll write, exercise, do lunch, sometimes have a nap, go back, write some more. And then in the evenings, I will normally think about the next day's work. What's the next chapter going to start with, or what's the next transition going to be? And I outline vociferously. I will outline, first of all, I will think about a novel for years before I write it. So right now I'm writing my 8th book. I have my 9th book in my head. I've got this historical fiction in my head, and I've got a 10th book, just kind of a rough idea of what I'm going to do with that's percolating. I have sketchbooks where for each one of those ideas, and I will write those ideas down in these sketchbooks. Then when it comes time to actually write the novel, I'll get that sketchbook out and I will outline the novel from beginning to end. And I will take several months doing that because I want to, again, go deeper into my thought process, different ideas. I want to make mistakes in the outlining process, not the writing process, because you could write 10, 20,000 words down a tangent and realize it's going nowhere. If you're outlining, you see that tangent and you think that's a good idea, but then as you get to the 3rd or 4th page of outlining, you see where it falters, and you've only wasted a day or two instead of a couple of weeks. But yeah, I outline, and then when I go to write, I will outline the chapter. I want to make sure that there's an arc to the chapter. A scene should begin with either a positive or negative charge to the emotions and should end on the opposite. So if you begin a scene and the character is happy, you should end the scene that they're sad, or something has happened to change that happiness, or if they're confused, then they're knowledgeable, or there's some change from positive to negative or negative to positive over the course of a scene. So that's what I'm thinking about in the evenings as I'm, relaxing. And next day I go down, I outline the chapter, put my laptop on my lap and start writing.
This next question probably won't take much time, but it's a pretty interesting question. Are any subjects taboo by law?
By law? By law, no. By common sense and morality. I don't think Lolita would fly very well today. As much as I applaud the effort, but books like that, there are certain books that I just don't think should be written. But yet, other than that, no, I don't think the law doesn't stop an American from writing anything. Good taste will, though.
There are several authors writing crime fiction today that is set in the Ozarks, like Jake Hinkson, Laura McHugh, Nancy Allen, who's a professor here at Missouri State. Do you think this region lends itself to the noir genre more so than other areas of the country?
Not more than other areas of the country, but it's sort of like, having children. all have their special abilities and talents. So if you're writing about New York City, it's going to be a very different novel than if you're writing about Springfield, Missouri. And same with Minnesota versus Florida. You're going to put the flavor of your local environment into the story. I'm a huge fan of Laura McHugh. She and I were finalists for one of the book awards for our debut novels. And so that's where we met. And so I've been a fan of hers for a long time now. And actually, when I was getting ready to write my last novel, which had a female protagonist, I was reading books by female authors with female protagonists. And I think I read most, if not all, of Laura's books as part of that process. But yeah, Missouri has its own rich history, its own, rich culture, its own problems. It's certainly its own geographical and geological environment. When I was writing Nothing More Dangerous, my wife and I went down to the Gasconade River over by Dixon just to spend, like 4 or 5 days out in the woods, because it had been a long time since I was in those woods. And I wanted to just go back and get a sense of what it's like to, remember what it's like, what sounds you hear in the katydids, and something Missouri, my part of Missouri, has now that they didn't when I was growing up is armadillos. We did not have armadillos, and now they're there. So, but yeah, I think that Missouri has a rich palette to draw from.
Laura McHugh, by the way, we're trying to line up a visit with her this fall. So
I will recommend you.
Yeah. The friendship between the mothers of Bodie and Thomas seems particularly well done and rich. Could you comment on that specific friendship?
When I went back to outline Nothing More Dangerous, the first thing I did for the outline was I wrote down all the characters, and behind their names I wrote what it is they desire and what it is they fear. I want to know, especially those two, desire and fear, because when you know who a person is at their core, you know how they're going to react in the most stressful scenes. And when I did that, I actually went back further for the mother, for Bodie's mother, and created who she was before Bodie's father died. So I had this person who she was before the father died, which that aspect of her character did not exist in the previous iterations of this manuscript. I just had her starting, from in 1976, and I didn't understand her backstory. So once I understood her backstory, I realized that she had a journey which was to come out of her shell. And because the Elgin family, Thomas's mother in particular, that they're the catalyst for all these changes, it just made sense to have Thomas's mother be the catalyst for, is it Emma? To remember her mother's name, to come out of her shell. So for Bodie's mom to come out of her shell. So the relationship was developed out of that need to have a journey for Bodie's mother.
One more question here about from one of our participants who's obviously trying to get into the business. The question is, are agents still devoted to specific areas of writing? This particular person is writing in several different genres, a couple of plays, short film scripts, rough draft of a novel. Are any agents that are interested in someone who can't stay in one path but has multiple interests?
Within that realm of the business, what you got to understand is, for example, my books are published by Hachette. Hachette has imprints, one of which is Little Brown. Right. Within Little Brown, there are imprints, of which one is Mulholland, and Mulholland is my publisher. So the editors at Mulholland, they focus on a specific type of book within that broader umbrella. They're focused just on literary mysteries. That's what they want to publish. So when you're an agent and you're dealing with an editor, you're going to want to make sure that the book you send to them fits their genre, their category. So you're normally going to limit yourself as an agent to a handful of genres so that you can develop strong relationships within that world. Now, this isn't true of all. I mean, there's agents out there who run the gamut in terms of genres they do. My agent is specifically with an agency that they focus on a limited number of genres. Literary mysteries, my agent specifically, that's her main thing. But the agency itself, the owner of the agency does some nonfiction stuff, but they limit it because that's the way the industry is kind of designed. Now, with that said, if you get an agent that has a larger firm behind them, you're going to have agents within that firm that do other things. So if you can, what I would recommend is take your best shot, the novel or manuscript that you think is going to have the best chance of succeeding, and get that to an agent. And if you get into an agency that has like 6, 7 agents, there's going to be one in there who does horror, one that does romance, and so they're going to have connections. My agency also has sub-agents who do movie and TV rights. So I wrote a spec pilot and gave it to my agent to give to my sub-agent. Who knows? You never know. So there is branching up, but for the most part, they try and keep it rather narrow. That's my own perspective. Another agent or a writer might have a different perspective, but that's how I see it.
Several reviewers have compared Nothing More Dangerous to Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. How do you feel about that comparison?
I'm fine with it. So I was assigned To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in high school. And I will tell you, I didn't read it when I was in high school. I read very few books in high school because I didn't like reading. I honestly think that I have undiagnosed attention deficit disorder. I've always had difficulty reading books. I love listening to audiobooks, but reading books, my mind would always be off daydreaming. I would come across a sentence or a word here or there that would just strike my own imagination, and I could be staring at this page for 20 minutes, not reading, because I'm in my own head. So I did not read it when I was in high school. And when I started studying writing, this book kept getting thrown out there as being this great book. So I read it, and I was floored by it. The voice in particular, because narrative voice is something that has always triggered something in me in terms of as a reader or a listener of novels. And her voice is so wonderfully written. And so I read it, and then I reread it. And I think that book I've read more than any other book I own. And one of the things that I didn't want to write the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird. What I wanted to do was write my version of that story in terms of, in To Kill a Mockingbird, the racism is overt. It's a time when the Jim Crow laws were in full effect. I grew up in an era where it was post civil rights legislation, and so we were all supposed to be beyond that. And so I grew up being told that we weren't racist, we weren't prejudiced. At the same time, if you read Nothing More Dangerous, there are racial slurs and racial jokes and racial understandings that are abhorrent. And every one of those is one that I either said or did or heard when I was in high school. And so that's when I talk about my own journey is, I really didn't think I was racist when I was a teenager, but yet I would tell these jokes and think that was just fine. I would use these terms, and as Bodhi says, it's just an expression. But it's not just an expression. These words have history. These words have meaning that goes beyond just what you think you're conveying. The N word, it has such weight to it that growing up in Missouri, it was just a word, and I never understood that history behind it. I forgot where I was going with this. What was the question again?
How about Harper Lee's comparison?
Harper Lee's, yeah. So I wanted to write a story about that more latent, that more hidden racism, where someone like me could think, I am not prejudiced. And actually in the novel, Bodie has a scene where he says, I'm not prejudiced. I think blacks can be just as good as whites if they try hard enough. And that is the starting point for my story, where I think Harper Lee would not have left off there just yet.
Well, I think we've gotten to just about everyone's questions, and we're coming up on about an hour. This seems like a good place. Any last thoughts, Alan, that you'd like to share?
It is a shame that we've been reduced to doing this by Zoom. I was really looking forward to coming down to Southern Missouri.
We've been working on this for a year.
Yeah. My dad actually owns a timeshare down in Branson. I was going to try and stay there and do this, but I'm hoping that we could try and do it again someday in person. It'd be fun. But I want to thank you for inviting me. It was my privilege and pleasure to be here and talk to you all. Or excuse me, talk to y'all.
I should point out that when we first started talking to Alan, his latest novel was brand new. So it's a year later, but I'm very, very glad that you agreed to do this with us virtually. And we do look forward to having these events again in person. But I'm so glad we had the opportunity to do this. So Alan, thank you very much. One of your several people are commenting. Thank you for sharing your time and talent. Congratulations on your success. Excellent talk and interview. So thank you, Alan, very much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you all for participating. And once again, this is recorded, so at some point it will be on our YouTube channel. From all of us here at the Meyer Library, thank you very much and good evening.